Chapter 4. We will get through this together. Supporting students through grief and loss. My classroom community. Simon started to shut down in class regularly. He would curl himself up in the tightest of balls and wriggle his way behind the computer cart or in between thick winter coats. I always wondered what he was thinking as he wrapped his lanky arms around his legs and rocked back and forth. Maybe he was perseverating on a difficult thought, or maybe his mind was going completely blank as the gentle rocking soothed him. Either way, Simon was checked out of our classroom world, floating somewhere by himself. The incidents that triggered this reaction were always small. Someone stepped on his shoe, or another student cut in front of him in line. The truth was, these little slights were not the cause of Simon's distress. I was told Simon's mother had moved to Nevada. Whether or not she would return was uncertain. Simon was grieving. It took me months to figure out how to gently coax Simon back into our lessons. At first, nothing I did or said worked. I waited out his episodes. I attempted to bribe him with promises of free time. I gave him community incentives like earning the whole class extra recess, and I gave him access to calming activities. I also enlisted the aid of our school psychologist who worked with Simon privately. Regardless of my approach, he would sit tightly woven in a ball until one day I stumbled upon a strategy that broke him out of his guarded state. Simon had wedged himself into a small place between the computer cart and the wall, making himself invisible. Instead of asking him to join the class, I said, "Simon, can you help me push these chairs? The kids left them all a mess, and I think I need your help." Taken off guard, he stood up and started pushing in the chairs with me. I showered him with praise. "Thank goodness you're here. This room would be such a disaster if we didn't have you helping us. We need you." "Yes," he agreed. "These chairs really need to be pushed in. Everyone has just left this place a complete mess." From then on, "Can you help me?" seemed like a secret password. Feeling that he was contributing seemed to lift Simon out of a dark place. I think that's because it made him feel he was needed and appreciated by the class. He knew our class would not function without him. The rest of the school year was not perfect, but he was always more engaged after he completed a task that helped the classroom, whether it was turning on lights or wiping off tables. Simon found strategies that would help him bounce back after his emotions overwhelmed him, like taking deep breaths or finding a chair in a quieter place in the room. He still struggled at times, but I could see he was processing his grief and developing skills that would help him overcome this challenge. As a teacher, it was essential for me to uncover the true cause of Simon's change in behavior. He was not following class rules, but not out of defiance. He was grieving. His refusal to participate in classroom activities and lessons was not something to take personally because it was a cry for help. As teachers, we should work hard to recognize students' needs so we can help them through difficult times in their lives. Childhood grief and mourning. Death and loss are difficult subjects to discuss even with adults. For teachers, tackling these subjects with children is even more daunting. It can be a challenge to find the precise words to say or know what supportive moves to make. Often, our apprehension at broaching the subjects of grief and loss might cause us to avoid conversations that could be uncomfortable, so we do not respond at all. But it does not have to be this way. As teachers, we can learn how to support our students even through the most difficult times in their lives. In fact, it's imperative that we do so because when a child is dealing with a negative spiral of grief and loss, that child is not in the best position to learn. First, it's important for teachers to recognize that grief may be a response to something other than death. In children, grief might be the result of the absence of a parent due to many reasons like divorce, deportation, incarceration, or abandonment. The loss of a pet can often become a source of grief for children, and so can changing homes. It may be easy for us adults to dismiss when it happens to children, but genuine grief can be the consequence of the ending of a romantic relationship or the conclusion of a friendship. The process of dealing with that grief is called mourning, and it can last for varying degrees of time. The American Cancer Society explains mourning as the outward expression of loss and grief, Mourning includes rituals and other actions that are specific to each person's culture, personality, and religion. Mourning is an important step and should not be rushed. Every incident of death or loss is different. Therefore, every response will be equally unique. Some students may exhibit strong signs of anguish, while others might appear as though nothing happened. George Bonanno, a clinical psychologist at Columbia University and author of The Other Side of Sadness, has studied grief for over 20 years. Among his most provocative findings is that 50 to 60% of mourners show no symptoms of grief 1 month following the loss. Some even overcome the grief within days. Due to this spectrum of grief responses, it is important to give children the amount of time they need to mourn, and it is equally important to understand the variety of ways in which grief is displayed and experienced. How children grieve. Due to the natural evolution of a child's development, their understanding of death and loss changes as they age. Young children can falsely interpret death as intentional abandonment or a temporary situation that can be reversed. One friend of mine remembers losing his father at 7 years old. He waited each day for his father to return home, even though the adults in his life had told him his father had died. Since he was so young, he did not comprehend what this meant. His understanding of death had been confused by seeing a character on a TV show die, then seeing the same actor miraculously appear on a different program. No one explained the difference to him, so he stared out the window for years, searching for his father. Children under the age of 8 tend to be satisfied with a simple, clear explanation of death or loss. However, by the time a child is between the ages of 8 and 10, they enter another development stage and their reaction may be different. Some children believe death won't happen to them, while others, a death in the family or the broader community can prompt intense curiosity and speculation. Children at this age begin to look to adults for more nuanced answers to their questions. However, during pre-adolescence and adolescent stages of development, most children depend on their peers for support as they build their own understanding of death and loss. At this stage, they begin to see life as finite. Some teens and tweens begin to build a spiritual belief system to help develop their understanding, while others become more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. It's important to note that as children age, there may be additional periods of grieving even after the initial reaction is long past. For example, a child who experienced the loss of a close family member at a very young age might suddenly need support when they enter middle school or become a teenager. I remember a high school classmate of mine experiencing deep sorrow over the loss of his sister who sadly had died at birth many years before. At the time, I didn't understand why he suddenly felt this way when the loss had occurred so many long years ago. But when we understand how the developmental stages affect grief responses, we realize that this is completely normal. Know the signs of grief and loss. The Dougy Center, the National Center for Grieving Children and Families, has compiled a list of common responses of the grieving child or teen for schools. The organization reminds teachers that remembering that each person grieves differently, it is important for each student to feel heard and accepted. It advises that each response should be accepted and allowed as long as it is not harmful to the student or another person. Academic responses to grief. A difficulty focusing or concentrating, inattentiveness or daydreaming, failing or declining grades, incomplete work or poor quality of work, increased absences or reluctance to go to school, forgetfulness and memory loss, overachievement, trying to be perfect, and language errors and word finding problems. Behavioral responses to grief include noisy outbursts, disruptive behaviors, and hyperactive-like behavior. Aggressive behaviors, frequent fighting, non-compliance to requests, an I don't care attitude, isolation or withdrawal, increased need for attention. Emotional responses to grief include insecurity, issues of abandonment, safety concerns, concern about being treated differently than others, depression, hopelessness, intense sadness, overly sensitive, frequently tearful, irritable, regression to times when things felt safer and more in control, a preoccupation with death, wanting details, a need for checking in on surviving family members and friends, and appears to be unaffected by death. Social responses to grief: withdrawal from friends, activities, or sports, changes in relationships with teachers and peers, use of drugs and alcohol, inappropriate sexual behavior or acting out, stealing and shoplifting. And last, physical responses to grief include increased requests to visit the nurse, stomach aches, headaches, heartaches, hives, rashes, itching, nausea, upset stomach, increased illnesses, low resistance to colds and flu, loss of appetite or increased eating, and low energy or weakness. So, how common is grief? The Children's Grief Awareness Day campaign released staggering statistics about just how many children experience grief and loss. 1 out of every 20 children aged 15 and younger will suffer the loss of one or both parents. 1.5 million children are living in a single-parent household because of the death of one parent. 1 in 5 children will experience the death of someone close to them by age 18. 1 in every 1,500 secondary school students dies each year. It is estimated that 73,000 children die every year in the United States, and of those children, 83% have surviving siblings. These numbers make it clear that teachers will inevitably teach students who are experiencing grief in their classrooms. But it's important to note that these particular statistics focus primarily on death as the instigating factor for grief. Since we know that grief responses can be triggered by other forms of loss, we must realize that the net grief cast in our classroom stretches even wider. The Pew Charitable Trust found that in 2010, 1.2 million inmates, over half of the 2.3 million people behind bars, are parents of children under the age of 18. That means that a staggering 1 out of every 28 children in the United States has a parent in prison. This does not account for the number of incarcerated siblings, close family members, or friends, which might also cause a student to grieve. Additionally, separation from parents or family members due to immigration issues is another issue that can cause our students to experience grief or loss. When a parent is deported, some children accompany their parents out of the country and some stay here in American schools, sometimes entering into foster care. The Pew Research Center found that children with at least one unauthorized immigrant parent made up 6.9% of students enrolled in kindergarten through 12th grade in 2012. These statistics indicate that our classrooms serve many students who are grieving the loss of a loved one or living under the threat of losing a loved one. The unfortunate reality is that for many reasons, our classrooms will have children who are grieving. Transitioning families and grief. The students who enter our classrooms each day can also be shaped by grief and loss they have experienced in the context of a changing family. A transition in the family, like divorce or adoption, can also cause grief. According to Scientific American, every year 1.5 million school-aged children will experience the divorce of their parents. Psychologist and parenting expert Carl E. Pickert explains that children tend to react differently to divorce based on their age and maturity. Adolescents who are already acting more independently of their parents tend to deal more aggressively with divorce, often acting in a mad, rebellious way. This might include acting out, disobeying rules, and being more selfish or self-involved. In contrast, Pickard explains in Psychology Today that younger children are more dependent on their parents, and because of that, can harbor hopes that everything will return to normal once their parents choose to love one another again. They might feel anxious and insecure about their world because it becomes difficult to predict what will happen on a day-to-day basis. Essentially, divorce and separation can elicit a more regressive response in the child and a more aggressive response in the adolescent, according to Pickard. Regardless of age, these responses can also affect learning. A 2011 study published in the American Sociological Review demonstrates how divorce can affect a child's ability to learn. Researchers found that children whose parents had divorced earned lower math scores during and after the divorce process. There was also a negative effect on interpersonal skills, such as the ability to make and maintain friendships. It's important to note that the researchers who conducted this particular study noted that the overall effect on children was limited. For example, reading test scores weren't affected by divorce. Like divorce, adoption can dramatically change the shape of a family and cause some children to experience grief. Rachel Burnett Doherty MSW is an adoption professional at an international adoption agency. She encourages teachers to put an adoptive child's experience in a broader context. She states, "There is no typical adoption. Adoption happens in many forms, so each child's experience and reaction to that experience will be unique. Teachers should be aware that in some adoptions, grief and loss can play a big role, especially when a child's adoption experience causes emotional trauma during a crucial developmental stage. The legacy of this trauma can show up even years later. For example, if an adopted child is in the crucial stage between 8 and 10 years old and experiences a typical rejection from a peer, like being excluded from a lunch table, he or she might have what could appear to be an overreaction. A small incident like this could lead to a fight or an emotional outburst. A connection can be made from this negative behavior to the initial loss the child experienced being placed for adoption. Regardless of what causes a child to suffer grief or loss, we should remember that the experience and trauma linger long after the actual event. If and when a student suddenly begins to act out or show dramatic changes in behavior, we teachers should ask ourselves, could the child's behavior be the result of grief? Supporting students through the grief process. As much as we wish we could, protecting children from difficult circumstances such as death and loss is not possible, nor is it beneficial for our students. We do them a better service when we acknowledge their grief and lead them to positive ways of dealing with the intense emotions that come along with it. Our classrooms can become a supportive environment for students before and after a grief incident occurs. Openly discussing issues of death as they arise organically, such as when a class pet dies or when characters pass away in literature, helps our students understand that death is an appropriate topic. Academic subjects such as life cycles, human anatomy, even great works of literature can become opportunities to develop students' understanding of death. It is a natural part of life, and I think death can appear in the academic life of a classroom. It's important that as teachers we know how to respond when a student has experienced grief or loss. Andrea Ruth Hopkins, MED, early childhood educator with the St. Paul Public Schools and grief facilitator, lays out 3 roles for educators responding to a grief or loss incident in their classroom. Number 1, to help children feel safe while acknowledging the reality of death. Number 2, to promote an accepting classroom atmosphere where children's feelings are supported. And number 3, to provide developmentally appropriate learning opportunities that allow children to discuss death. Supporting a student through a traumatic event like a death may not be our area of expertise, but we need not to be intimidated. Professor Linda Goldman offers this advice for teachers who are unsure of their role. It is important for educators to be present with grieving students and encourage them to share where they are in their grief process and what they need. Have faith and trust in them. The children are the only ones that can relay their personal experience. Allow them to explore and express themselves freely. She adds, we as educators must create guidelines to aid children through their grief journey. Protect them in school during vulnerable times and make their classroom an oasis of protection to explore life issues with support and guidance. Helping a student through grief can mean offering a listening ear or an open door for questions. When family, friends, and teachers rally around a student, the more caring adults on a teacher's When family, friends, and teachers rally around a student, the more caring adults on a student's team, the better. Teacher tools. Number 1, tell the truth. We need to be prepared to respond to our students' questions about grief and loss in a way that satisfies curiosity and fosters resiliency. When children ask questions about death or loss, they expect complete answers. When adults offer a restricted or limited answer, or worst of all, no answer, most children will assume the topic is off limits. Without an adult to turn to, a grieving child quickly can become isolated. When a student asks you a question, take it seriously and answer it honestly. Try to avoid cliches about death. Children often take our words literally, and this can cause confusion. Well-meaning but abstract euphemisms like crossed over or has gone away or went to sleep for a long time could cause confusion and anxiety in a child. Even common phrases like is watching over us or wanted to go to heaven might unintentionally confound the issue if a child does not have a well-developed understanding of physical death. Ensure that the reality of the situation is made clear. A good rule of thumb is to be direct and simple. Professor Goldman advises that many children are comfortable with concise and truthful answers, especially at young ages. If explanations are too long or contain too much information, some children may tune out the conversation. There are no categorically right or wrong ways of talking to a child about death or loss, but when a child asks a difficult question about death, it's best to answer in age-appropriate, deliberately clear language. Though the chart on the next page is adapted from Professor Goldman's book, Great Answers to Difficult Questions About Death, it is far from a comprehensive list of questions your student may ask or answers you might give, but I hope it empowers you to have open conversations with them. I know I feel better knowing I have a few simple sentences in my tool belt to use when students ask difficult questions without much warning. So the chart is on page 103, and it has a list of difficult questions with honest answers, and I'm just going to read through each of those. Difficult question number 1. What does death mean? Honest answer. Death means that the body stops working. Sometimes people die when they are very old, very ill, or so injured that doctors and nurses can't make their bodies work anymore. Your friend is dead and will not be alive again. It is sad. Number 2. Was it my fault? Definitely not. You did not cause this to happen. It is in no way your fault. Sometimes kids can have guilty thoughts. They think if a person died or left, it must be their fault, and that is not true, and that is not what happened here. My sister is dying. What can I do? It is very sad to think of your sister dying. She is with you now, and there are things you can do to make her feel better. You can make her food. You can give her medicine. You can tell her a favorite story or a funny joke. You can even quietly hold her hand, and that can be very comforting if she feels ill or tired. Will I die too? That is a good question. I think you will live a long time, but no one can promise when or where someone will die. Lots of children worry about their health after someone they know dies. What if I forget about my mom? It is scary to think about forgetting your mom. We can do things to help you remember her. It is common for children like you to think if they aren't thinking about their person all the time, it means they have forgotten them or don't love them. You don't have to think about your mom all the time to love her. It's okay. For example, one day during CQC, my daily meeting where students can share a celebration, question, or concern, a wide-eyed student shot her hand up in the air and said, I have a concern. Can cancer kill you? My grandma has cancer and I want to know if she'll die. It was quite a weighty question for a Monday afternoon, but I was able to give an answer. I stuck with my plan and was simple and honest. I said, sometimes cancer does kill people, but other times people with cancer can live for a long time. It usually depends on what kind of cancer a person has and how quickly a doctor can treat it. I don't know about your grandma's cancer, but maybe your mom does. Can you ask her? Big brown eyes blinked back at me as the student said, I did ask my mom and she told me to ask my teacher. I answered the rest of her questions in the same manner. Another student chimed in, asking if you caught cancer like you would catch a cold. Then another student asked if pneumonia would kill her dad. This discussion did take up some class time, but it was worth it. Maybe you, like me, have read books about teaching that advise you not to allow your class to get sidetracked and keep a laser focus on the lesson at hand. But I think about this little girl wondering all day if her grandmother was going to die. Had I not addressed her concerns, she would have not been able to do any of the rigorous work I expected of her with this burning question racing around in her mind. For me, these discussions are not a distraction, but rather a key to allow for learning. By being open with my students, I'm able to create a sense of community and an environment where all students can have their concerns addressed so they can turn their attention to learning. If your students lead you into a discussion like this, remember that you can always say, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe someone else does. We can ask. Ending your conversations by saying, "If you think of any other questions, let me know," helps the child know their questions and concerns are valid and they can come to you. They may come to you with more questions or they may not, but feeling that there is a person who cares about them and is willing to answer their questions eases a grieving child's anxiety and frees up mental space for learning. These are difficult conversations, but resist the urge to avoid them. The National Alliance for Grieving Children explains that although it may be challenging to share the truth about how someone died, honest answers build trust, help provide understanding, and allow children to feel comfortable approaching us with questions because they know they can trust us to tell them the truth. Children know more than we think they do, and by not telling the truth, we risk leaving children to process complicated information on their own rather than with the loving adults in their lives. When a child experiences a loss, their emotional and physical stability can be disrupted. But as they ask questions and get honest answers, they are able to process and understand a tragic event. Number 2, memory books. Memory books are a way for a grieving child to record their feelings, thoughts, and memories of a person who is not with them. How you choose to put together a memory book is very flexible. It can take the form of a written journal, a photo album, or even a shoebox of special objects. Some cultures' form of a memory book is a small table or an altar in the home or workplace dedicated to the remembrance of a loved one. A memory book can be completed by an individual child, or when a loss affects a whole class, compiled by a group of students. The memory book functions as a way for students to find home for their ruminating thoughts of a person who has died and is not able to be present. This work is helpful in the same way that a to-do list aids us in assembling and categorizing tasks that need to be completed. Instead of obsessing over all the things that need to be done so we don't forget them, simply processing those ideas and recording them allows us to focus on completing tasks and activities. For a grieving child, recording their memories provides comfort that their memories will not be lost and gives them mental permission to contemplate other things. You might consider including the following within a memory book: photos or drawings of the special person, the special person's biographical information, including their birthday and the day they died, how the person died, favorite memories, funny memories, sad memories, interviews that record memories of friends and family, how the child wishes things could be, a letter to their special person or what they wish they could tell their special person, how the other members of the child's family are grieving, what life was like before and what life is like now, what feelings the child has experienced, a list of what the child is worried about, a list of hopes the child has, what it was like at the funeral or the last time they saw the person, a list of allies a child can talk to when they need support. These can be acutely personal topics to discuss, but they are all thoughts a bereaved child is likely contemplating. Teachers can use good judgment and sensitivity in the creation of a memory book that provides a safe way for a child to open up about their experiences. While compiling their memory book, students are able to discuss the grief incident and what thoughts or questions they might have. If those thoughts stay locked in the child's head, they become difficult to process. Creating some form of a memory book allows a grieving child to relive their experiences and process those memories while feeling secure and heard. Number 3, grief rituals. Most of us who have experienced a loss have performed a grief ritual to help us process the death or loss of a person we cared about. We may have lit a candle, said a prayer, or participated in a moment of silence. We do these rituals for a reason: console us and work through feelings of sorrow and abandonment in productive ways. Grief rituals can be thought of as deliberate gestures of remembrance that hold a significant meaning to the participants. Your school might even have evidence of a grief ritual. Our school does. We have a flower garden and a carefully painted rocking chair that commemorate the memory of a student who passed away. Teachers can take an active role in creating and allowing for grief rituals after a loss is experienced. Often when there is an incident that impacts a school community, school districts have a plan or recommendations in place. Your school district may have some form of a crisis response team that can assist with ideas and making arrangements for a grief ritual as part of their action plan. It might be meaningful for students or community members to participate in the planning of an event or ritual. Grief rituals in schools. Here are some ideas. Release balloons. Hold moments of silence. Hold a community forum for families, parents, staff, members, and students. Name a community space like a gymnasium, auditorium, or field. Produce a memory video. Compose songs, poems, or raps. Display photographs publicly. Make a mailbox available for students to send letters. Create a digital memorial on social media. Host a memorial event such as a talent show, spelling bee, or sports game. Read a piece of literature as a community on a related topic. Some of these rituals might feel difficult to participate in, especially if an incident has impacted you personally. One of the most powerful things we can do for our students in a time of loss is to model our own grief. As stable and caring adults, we can demonstrate a positive, empathetic response to a significant loss that our students will pay attention to. Being open and authentic with our feelings helps create an atmosphere where students feel free to share their thoughts and feelings too. Some deaths, especially those that can be viewed as preventable, can carry an extra weight. The Dougy Center, a National Center for Grieving Children and Families, recommends that all deaths and losses in a school community be acknowledged in the same way, whether it is a tragic accident, a drug or alcohol impacted death, or a suicide. They believe very strongly that whatever policy or precedent the school sets should apply to all deaths, because not having the same activity you would provide in a different kind of death gives the message that the student's life was not valued, or that we should sweep suicide deaths under the rug. According to the Dougy Center, memorials for students who have died as a result of suicide do not encourage others to take their lives. Rather, it is an excellent opportunity to educate your students, staff, and school community about preventing suicide. Still, not all grief rituals need to be community-focused or public. Private grief rituals can provide comfort as well. These rituals are often unique and deeply personal, like taking special care in packing up the possessions left behind, cataloging photos of the loved one, or cherishing gifts given. When I was a sophomore in high school, my older sister left home for the first time and moved to Quito, Ecuador. On the surface, I was unaffected. I did not want my family or teachers to know how much I missed her, for fear they would think I was overly sensitive. Secretly, I slipped into her bedroom each night and slept in her daybed for weeks after she left, carefully making the bed each morning so as not to be detected. While this loss was certainly not as acute as a death, I realized that I was doing this in order to ease the pain of my sister's absence. It was a form of a private grief ritual. Teachers do not necessarily need to provide private grief rituals for students, but we should accommodate them. A bereaved student might benefit from fidgeting with a special necklace, looking at photos on their cell phone, or listening to music that holds a special significance. Sometimes students experiencing grief feel comforted and protected by something as simple as baggy clothing or large jackets, which provide physical comfort as well as a psychological protective barrier. Exceptions to school rules might need to be made in order to allow for these private grief rituals. The presence of grief rituals throughout time and across cultures speaks to their significance in the mourning process. As educators, we should become more comfortable taking an active role in providing and allowing for these experiences for our students. In this way, we provide healing. Number 4, legacy projects, looking back, giving forward. After a loss, grieving students often feel powerless. They feel as though they have no control over what happened. The feelings of helplessness can be overwhelming. One way to overcome this is to lead your students in carrying out a legacy project, a service project that helps them feel empowered to take action on a related topic. There are a multitude of ways a legacy project can come to fruition. For bereaved students, participating in an activity uniquely connected to the person who was lost or taking active steps to raise awareness and contribute to prevention can be healing. There is no need to rush into implementing a legacy project. It is completely fine to even take time, even a substantial amount of time, to deal with the loss and meet the community's initial needs. Similarly, there is no right or wrong way to approach a legacy project. However, keep in mind that the goal is to empower your students to take action, and by doing so, regain a sense of control as they search for meaning in a loss. Possible legacy projects. Plant a memorial garden or tree. Send cards to surviving family members or friends. Create an art installation like a mural or mosaic. Raise funds to donate to a connected charity. Create an informational poster or website on a related topic. Raise awareness through social media campaigns. Research a related topic and interview experts in the field in order to compose books or essays that share the findings. Write newspaper articles or op-ed pieces taking a stance on a related topic. Donate books or toys to a related charity. Teach younger children a lesson about the related topic. Take care of the family's home as they grieve. Or plan a community meal or activity with special meaning. Make sure students or the school community are truly in charge of the project and that you as the teacher take on the role of the facilitator. A legacy project should be open to anyone who wants to participate, but the project should also be optional. So those who choose to process the loss in their own way have the space to do so. Additionally, legacy projects should be done in partnership with grieving family members and loved ones. I know a family whose daughter suddenly and tragically passed away during the school year. In response, the school created a loving memorial by dedicating a bench in her name. The bench unintendedly caused some mixed feelings for the girl's younger brother who continued attending the school. The family wanted teachers to know that it is important to consider the impact a project or memorial may have on the other siblings still attending the school, especially if it is a permanent fixture. We were touched by the gesture, but would have loved to be included in the discussions. When the larger community is witness to acts of service through a legacy project, it is an impressive model of generosity and empowerment. At our school, we have such a model, without fail. On the very first day of school, one of my ardent new students will ask the question, "When is Alyssa coming?" Alyssa never attended our school. My class and I never had the pleasure of meeting Alyssa, yet her presence has blessed our school community. The Alyssa the children speak of is Alyssa Hemmelgarn, a fourth grade girl whose compassion and love of reading characterized her life. Alyssa passed away on March 8, 2007, only 10 short days after being diagnosed with leukemia. In commemoration of her love of books, the organization Alyssa Cares was created. Her parents, Joe and Carol Hemmelgarn, visit 5 elementary schools in Denver several times a year to tell Alyssa's story and put brand new books in the hands and homes of each student. To date, more than 50,000 books have been cherished by students thanks to her legacy. Through Alyssa Cares, my students are able to select a new book to take home, but they receive a much greater gift. Each time Joe and Carol come to our school, they tell our students about a book Alyssa loved as well as share her story. Giving books to children is a gift to us, explains Carol. We have the opportunity to talk about our daughter, and kids are able to ask questions. For me, this has created an opportunity to discuss death and grief in an authentic way in my classroom. Just as important as giving books is providing students with a positive grief model. A legacy project you facilitate does not have to be as involved as forming a nonprofit organization. However, Joe and Carol's example show the ripple effect of a legacy project. As Carol says, our hope is that children, even young children, nurture the love of reading like our daughter, but we also want them to see the impact that one person can make. Not only can you and your students take active steps to process a loss and make a positive impact on the community in the process, but you can also be a model for your wider community. Number 5, grief and loss inventory. Since we know loss impacts a critical mass of our students and issues of grief may manifest themselves long after an incident occurs, one step a school can take is to create and maintain a grief and loss inventory. The goal of a school-wide grief and loss inventory is to make the appropriate teachers and school staff aware of what a particular student is coping with so they can be empathetic and supportive. Professor Linda Goldman describes a grief and loss inventory as a tool for creating and storing history on the grieving child throughout his or her academic life. To respect our students' privacy, this can be done with permission from families and the impacted students themselves. Often families and students are appreciative of having this information shared, albeit in caring ways, so there is widespread understanding and support without the need to individually retell their story to each teacher or staff member. It might also be appropriate to provide the family and sometimes the student with a copy of their entry into the school's grief and loss inventory so they are informed and approve of all information being shared. An example of a grief and loss inventory is found on page 117, and it has a place for the student's name, a brief explanation of the grief incident, family members and friends affected, important dates to be aware of, observations prior to the grief incident, known challenges, successful interventions, less successful interventions, and further notes. When a school community compiles an inventory, it is helpful to collect general information on the grief incident itself. It is also important to include relevant dates such as birthdays and deaths of loved ones that may have had a great impact on the child through the years. A thoughtful teacher might include notes on activities or topics that might be difficult for the student to explore as a result of their grief. Information on what could send a student into an agitated state, as well as which interventions have been beneficial and which have not, will ultimately help the child's future teachers and other school staff support the student. If the grief incident occurred in the middle of the student's academic career, it can be very helpful for an educator to record information and observations about the student's behavior and academic process prior to the event occurring. Grief can manifest it in ways that look similar to symptoms of learning disabilities and attention disorders, which means this information can be helpful to teachers and families so they are better able to differentiate true learning disabilities from grief-related behavior. Imagine a student who lost his father when he was 5 years old. Certainly, his kindergarten teacher would know of this, and his first grade teacher might also have been made aware of the situation. However, without a systemic way of preserving this information, the likelihood of each successive year's teacher understanding the impact of his circumstances drops. Imagine now that same little boy in 6th grade is getting into a physical fight on the anniversary of his father's death. A thoughtful educator made aware of how grief has affected this boy would be more likely to connect the dots and see the fight as related to feelings of loss than a teacher who has no knowledge of the student's history. The informed teacher would certainly take action to ameliorate the harm caused by the fight. He or she would also be able to support the student by addressing the root cause of the incident. If knowledge of the student's grief and loss had not been preserved in a school-wide inventory, educators and administrators could not have a complete understanding of the incident. A grief and loss inventory helps us record information that might otherwise be overlooked so we can support our students in the best way possible. You might feel that you do not have enough expertise or training to support a grieving child, but feel encouraged that as a teacher, you do not need to be an expert in grief or loss to make a positive impact during a difficult situation. You are a caring adult and can be present and authentic. Do not underestimate the impact of this. As Professor Goldman writes in her book, Children Also Grieve, we are powerless to control the losses and catastrophic events our children may need to face. But by honoring their inner wisdom, providing mentorship, and creating safe havens for expression, we can empower them to become more capable and more caring human beings.